All right, hey everyone. Welcome to the stream. This is Diagnose Your Chess. I think this is the fourth episode now. And today I'm being joined by Danny Cao. So I've actually known Danny for a little while through Chess Dojo. I feel like you were one of the original students there, and you've been around for a while. I feel like I've seen a lot of your games on stream by this point too. But why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself, maybe your age and where you're from, how long have you been playing chess?
Yeah, well, my name is Danny, and I'm 50 years old. And I started playing chess. I played a little bit of chess when I was a kid, but never got to the point of learning to castle. For example, to get my rooks out, I would go h4, a4, and then bring the rooks out. So I kind of played a murder chess with my mom's boyfriend, for lack of a better word, when I was very young. But really, I started playing chess probably when I was maybe 47 or 46 years old.
Cool.
Yeah. I had been curious about it, and then after getting married, I live in San Francisco, or lived in San Francisco. I currently live in Oakland, California, and that gave me a commute into the city. So I started playing just daily correspondence games on my phone, and that's how I got into chess. So
you were playing on chess.com?
Yes. So, and then at some point in 2019, I did my first over-the-board tournament at the Mechanics Institute, and that was quite the, you have to, as soon as you touch the piece, you have to move it. So that's a lot different than doing a daily correspondence game. And certainly with the onset of the pandemic, that's when I actually started having some time to do a little more of chess, and so started with joined the chess dojo
Right.
April 2020. So yeah.
Oh, awesome. Actually, that's cool. I had no idea you were local. I must have forgotten or something, because I'm of course I'm in the Bay Area as well. I'm just down in Mountain View, so
Yeah.
not that far. That's awesome. Yeah, the Mechanics Club is great. Hopefully when the quarantine is over, we'll be able to play a lot more tournaments again. Is that kind of in your plans to play more over the board?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I and the Mechanics Institute is it's just a beautiful club, and it's in a beautiful building. They've got an amazing library. It's a lot more than just a chess club. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of it, that most of the space is taken up by a huge library of just a general cultural library of arts and stuff. And yeah, it's awesome. Great. It's in a beautiful building. So yeah, awesome.
Very cool. All right, so let's talk about your chess. I put your rating here just kind of 1200. This is just a rough estimate, because I know you play on chess.com and on Lead Chess, and your ratings are definitely mixed on both sites, as they are for a lot of players. So this is just a very rough measurement, so people get a sense that you're a beginner. You're not a total beginner. You've been playing for a little while, but you're definitely have a long ways to go when it comes to climbing the ranks. Are you? I know you're currently working on your chess, but what are you currently doing, or what have you been up to lately?
Oh, in terms of chess, I started. Well, I did the one of your groups, the Grasshopper group in the chess dojo, and upon completing the app, or getting close to completing the project that you gave to that, I asked you for a coaching recommendation. So I've been studying with about once a week with Coach Gino Dimon, Discord Game Per Frame, and so I've been studying with him. So I've been doing the steps method with him. He also has got me started playing some 15+10 games. I think because I was playing more long control games, and I think I needed to get a little more just jumping into the pool and getting more games under my belt. I've been doing the steps method with him. And in terms of reading, I've been reading, if I get a chessboard out, I'll do the Yusupov book. His very first book. That seems like good positions to actually get a chessboard out and put those on the board. I've also read a little bit of Caro-Kann's Winning Chess, just the first book. And And I also been reading a chapter in a book called Chess for Life by Matthew Sadler. It's specifically the book on the chapter on Pierre Cramling, because I found that I would, after I play a game, I try to find better players who played that opening. And so her name kept coming up in some of my games, both from the white side and the black side. So I've been reading up that chapter, yeah.
Yeah, I've always found it useful to find like a champion of your opening, someone who plays the lines you play and plays them well, and kind of follow their, because they'll usually have a kind of like a consistent logic to their games, like often playing for the same ideas, and you can definitely replicate that because those same ideas will show up in your games as well. I'm just gonna like quickly start playing through some of the games here. I might ask you like questions at random points, but how often do you say, like you mentioned the steps method as this has been like the main thing you've been working on lately, and like how often will you work on your chess these days? Like what does a typical week look like? I know you play a lot of long time control games. Would you say you play like 1 or 2 a week?
Yeah, so I would say between 1 and 3 a week. Yeah.
Oh, cool. And these are like 45-minute games for those of you watching. So they take basically and I looked at the timestamps. You use your time in these games, so they take the full like hour and a half, 2 hours.
Yeah, I like to. Well, yeah, and I since I started, I would get into time trouble even in the 45, or even longer. But since I started playing the 15-10, I've found I've gotten less time trouble in the longer games.
Oh, okay.
Although the game we're looking at, I did spend a lot of time in the opening because I wasn't so familiar. But yeah, so 45 and 90-30, and then Mechanics Institute does like 60 plus 5. So that would be my 1 to 3 games a week, depending on what's going on.
Cool. And I mean, I would say the time trouble thing is actually, I think it's good for players of around your level, because it means you're using your time and like thinking about the position. What I more often see is players like signing up for these long time control games, but then playing it like a blitz or rapid game, and then they're done with like 40 minutes on their clock, and that's not really helpful. That's basically just playing blitz at that point. So I really like that you're using your time. I mean, it's like a very important part of the process to like, come up with moves and ideas, and then see how they kind of play out over the board.
Well, yeah, as starting out as a correspondence player, I'm gradually moving a little bit faster than one move per day.
Right. But you'll get there. I think I really like what you're doing in terms of playing long time control games, and then presumably like analyzing them, learning from those games, and then mixing in like some rapid games if you want to kind of like speed it up a little bit. But the 1 to 3 games a week is really good. And then when it comes to like the steps method, or like doing any kind of like solving, is that like something you're doing every day, or how's that for you?
I would say that probably I can probably work on chess about once every other day.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also a musician, and I do some teaching. So obviously work stuff comes into play, and not losing my trumpet chops. It's probably pretty important. So I'd say every other day. And I don't have a set regimen. It's usually what I have time for. So at various points in time. So I can't, it's usually like I'll maybe do a little binge thing as opposed to, so as opposed to playing, as opposed to looking at the steps method. So I did start off on step 2, the step 2 book in August. And so now I'm on step 3. So
Cool.
I was working at a pace so that I could get to that point just through one book. So
I've heard some really good things about the steps method. Like personally, I've never really worked with it or had students on it, but I've heard a lot of good things about it from coaches and other people that I really respect. So I think as far as like a structured program, it's probably one of the best. Seems like it's one of the best out there. So these games that we're looking at, these were all, I think, games you've played like in the last month or so, I guess.
Yeah, sorry, my computer just decided to fall asleep. I wasn't active enough on it. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no worries. We'll get you back. And so these are 45-minute games, and let's just play through here. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit about like what we can learn from these games and maybe some patterns that we might pick up. Looks like this one got really dangerous for white after this move, knight g5. Yeah. The method I just mentioned is there's a series of books called the Steps method that came out of, I think, the Netherlands, and they're very popular for coaches, and like specifically with coaches wanting like a very systematic method. It's a pretty well-known kind of like series of books and workbooks, so yeah, it's quite popular. Our student Danny here is playing white in this game. As much as I can, I'll try to always have the board flipped for the student's perspective. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this game, Danny. I thought there was actually some really interesting moments in here. So maybe you could explain in your own words how would you describe what happened in the game?
I know in the opening, I know usually, although we're not in the opening now, usually after analyzing the game later, I realized that I should have pushed the G pawn to G4 and drove the bishop. So at this move, I believe the correct move is to play G4, driving the bishop. So I did not know that. So that was the first, I guess, sort of thing that was vis-a-vis, if anyone's curious about openings.
Actually, maybe we could talk about this moment, yeah, because it definitely puzzled me a little bit, because you play knight h4, which is a normal move to hit the bishop and see where black wants to go. Some players will be tricky and go back like bishop c8, and they'll argue that, well, now your knight on h4 is silly, and that's certainly a valid move. And then their idea is that if you go back and bring your knight to the center, then they'll develop and be like, okay, just, repeating the position. The white has other moves. For example, you could play like e3 here, or even e4, to avoid like bring your knight back right away. So that's kind of an interesting possibility. But black plays bishop g4. You correctly hit him with h3. I think this is a really useful move here because, again, either he's forced to go back or he has to go back on this diagonal and then loses his original diagonal. And then you just go back knight f3. So yeah, what was the idea behind this one?
I took a lot of time, and it was basically, I felt like I had two choices to make, is to either go back or push the g4 pawn. And I didn't feel comfortable doing that because I didn't know which side I would be castling on. So, and I guess there's a general rule of thumb not to move the pawns that you're going to be castling to the side on. So that was my train of thought, is I wasn't confident enough to play g4.
Right.
So I wanted to play g4, but I thought principle-wise it was not the right thing to do. So at that point I was like, what is my knight doing over there?
So you just bring it back. Yeah, it's a lot. Actually, it's a really interesting thing that happens. So you of course know David from Chess Dojo, David Pruis, who's international master, and he made this really good point in one of his videos about like not playing moves in the opening that you don't fully like understand.
Yes.
And I think it might be a good example because maybe you saw this like knight h4 idea somewhere, and indeed this is the move a lot of strong players would possibly make in this position, but then you got to follow it up with g4, which you, I think, correctly didn't feel comfortable doing because this is a very aggressive move to make here for white. Like, you're weakening your king side forever. You've already weakened the queen side. It's not clear where white's king is going to go now, because queen side castling is going to be dangerous. King side castling is also going to be now a little bit more dangerous. So this is certainly a very legitimate way to play, but it's kind of like you're kind of walking a tightrope here with white, because you're getting the 2 bishops, which is nice, and getting a lot of space, but that comes with some drawbacks as well. So
Yes.
I feel like a lot of players would be a lot happier playing, I guess, like a more straightforward approach with a move just like e3 here.
Yes.
And then just like taking back the pawn on c4 and basically just playing in the center. And I think most coaches would say, like, in general, you don't want to mess around with too many fancy like pawn moves on the king side if you're not really sure about what you're doing. It's better just to stick to like general principles that you've probably heard a million times at this point, but just like, you know, focusing on the center, developing castling, and then playing the middle game, which is essentially what you did once you got to this moment and you were like, I don't want to play g4, and then you just started playing like normal chess.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a good question in the chat. Wouldn't you want to play bishop f4 before e3 to get the bishop out? Yeah, this is kind of like I guess a small opening detail. The problem with developing the bishop really early on in this position is that you get hit with knight d5, and this is annoying because our bishop is under attack, and then if we take on d5, black, of course, in this case gets to take with the pawn and secure their c4 pawn. So then it's really hard for white to now win this one back. So that's kind of the issue with these bishop f4 moves. And since white still needs to win back the pawn on c4, it's like we can't exactly have everything. So that's why white usually just plays a pretty timid e3, takes on c4. And white's idea here is that now we have 2 pawns in the center. Black only has this one e-pawn. And when we castle and we try to push e4, white will be able to kind of achieve that big center. So for example, if black were to, let's say, just make some random moves and not really pay attention to what's happening, white would go queen e2, black castles, e4, and already white is doing fantastic because we got this e4 push in. Now our 2 pawns are taking a lot of space, and it gets even worse as like e5 we're winning a piece. So this is a very cooperative variation. Obviously black doesn't have to play this way, but this is kind of the ideal of what white is kind of hoping for in this line. And then the bishop, of course, is able to open up too. Okay, so let's continue. So, oh wait, this is the wrong line. So knight h4, then we brought this one back. Castles, bishop d2, knight b6, bishop drops back to e2. Definitely reasonable to kind of like break the pin, and you don't have to deal with the pressure. Bishop d6, a5. I like this move, gaining space and hitting the knight. Knight d5, and I'm sure the engine told you that your next move was not ideal, but the question is, why is this exchange no good?
Well, black has a number of ways to recapture that would likely favor the pawn structure, I guess.
That is a good guess. It has to do with the structure here. So, Shanghai Check in the Twitch 24 chat is right. So the issue is when we take on d5, and we let black take with the pawn. In this case, they take with the e-pawn, which I think was a good idea. We now give them control over the square on e4, which black didn't have.
Okay.
And when we say control, what we really mean is pawn control. Because in the previous position, of course, black's knight was also kind of fighting for the e4 square. But this doesn't really give black control because white can actually push e4 as long as it's defended, right? And be able to take over. Now in this immediate case, e4 here I think is not working because black can take on c3, and then whichever way we recapture, then black wins the pawn on e4. So this is a move that white has to prepare. But with knight takes d5, the problem is that we are now well, basically making it a lot harder for us to achieve this break. Now, whenever we play e4, we're not really taking space. We're just losing, or we're just trading pawns.
Yep.
Now, I do like a5 here, but I think at this point, the way to kind of prepare this, so one natural way is like a move like queen c2, where we develop the queen, we connect the rooks, and we kind of prepare to play e4. Whereas in this case, when we go e4, knight takes e3, and recapture, now of course pawn is still defended. So we're able to capture the center. And I think if we're able to achieve this, then we are, yeah, definitely happy as white. It was also totally possible to play e4 in this position. In fact, maybe we should even consider this one over a5, because here we get to play e4 right away. And we kind of capture the space, we threaten e5, we also open up our bishop, which we're probably happy about. So yeah, a lot of benefits to this move here as well. Okay, so I would say this was kind of like a minor strategic mistake, because we make a trade that kind of makes our position worse, right? But not a big deal. A6, B6, B4. So now you start pushing on the queen side. Bishop C7. And now B5. Queen D6. Threatening a very unpleasant bishop takes F3 move. So knight E5. Bishop G6. Takes. Wow, this game got very hectic. Knight E4. Rook C1. F6. So this is where, yeah, black's counterattack gets quite bothersome. Knight F3, bishop went back. Again, threatening bishop takes F3. So you play G4. Then your opponent hit you with knight G5. And yeah, he's just kind of playing on this one but very powerful idea, unfortunately, just trying to deflect your knight from this H2 square. Okay, now Engine says white could have defended here with king G2. The funny idea, knight takes F3, king takes F3, because taking with the bishop leads to mate.
Yes.
So, yeah, very funny defense. And when I see lines like this, what it means is not that like, oh, you could have saved the game. It means like your position was under heavy fire. If this is, if this was the only defense, that means like, yeah, we were already in big trouble. So let's go back. Let's see how we could have tried to maybe avoid this fate. One thing I noticed here, you know, with this move B4, I would say it's probably not the most like useful thing for us to do in the position. I would have much preferred starting with the rook here, like rook C1, and just immediately attacking the pawn and then forcing black to defend it. Actually, with this one move, the whole game might have been different, because if your opponent has to defend the pawn, he might go like queen D7 here. Then he doesn't quite get the same, you know, battery on the diagonal.
Yeah.
And I think white here is totally fine. Actually, the moves like knight E5 come to mind immediately that are really interesting. Like take, bishop takes E2, queen takes E2. And, well, the idea would be to follow up with F4 and support the pawn on E5 and start taking a lot of space with the pawns, just as one possibility. Okay, but yeah, we got hit with this like really vicious counterattack. And here, yeah, we took on C6, which seems like, I mean, seems good just to grab a pawn. Black doesn't really have any immediate threats. There is this move F4 that often comes up as a way of strengthening the knight on E5, but also the real point of this move is to kind of try to trap the bishop on G6.
Okay.
So this is a nice kind of tactical idea to keep in mind, actually, because it's tough for black to deal with F5. The bishop is running short on squares. And then if they play bishop E4, they kind of take that square away from their knight. Like, I think the knight wanted to jump to this square, so this is kind of like a nice achievement.
Okay.
Because your opponent found a nice plan with this knight e4 and then like f6. This was definitely very well played by black. Like, he really found a good way to put pressure here.
Yeah, I feel like I missed the opportunity to play f4.
Yeah, that was a nice one. Common idea to support like knight on e5. Here, I guess at this point g4 wasn't totally necessary. A lot of times this move rook e1, or for black, it can be like rook to e8. This is a possible way of dealing with the incoming attack if your king has access to these escape squares. So it's always something we have to kind of judge, case by case basis, because it's like takes. The queen comes in with check, king f1, and then the idea is to kind of run away on the light squares. And if black isn't really able to generate enough of an attack, then you actually you can survive this.
Yeah, I can see rook to e1, and then if bishop takes f3, and then white bishop takes on f3, then my king has the hiding space on e2.
Yeah, so it's not like it's usually not the ideal way of dealing with this kind of attack, like queen on d6, bishop on c7, but it's a very useful one to know, because a lot of times you are fine, and the engine here is actually giving white a huge advantage, which I think is not really realistic. I think the position is super complicated. But the thing that is actually troublesome for black here is that if the queen on h2 doesn't deliver, mate, and then the queen is actually really misplaced, and you're just going to start playing like queen b3 and going after the counterattack.
Yes.
So important thing to remember, like when we're attacking or when the opponent is attacking, a lot of times it's like you're really investing a lot of time into that. And then if the attack doesn't pan out, then you might be collapsing on the other side of the board. So it can be very, very double-edged. But let's jump to another game. Actually, one game I think could be interesting was... I think this one is actually worth looking at. Just my brief recollection of what happened in these games. In this game, you're playing black. And so we got the Caro. Let me flip the board here. There we go. Is this your main opening, Caro-Kann?
I've sort of toggled between the Caro-Kann and the prior to actually when I started taking lessons with Gino started having me play the Caro-Kann just to familiarize myself with the concept of putting your pawns on light squares and trading off the light squared bishop. Prior to that, I was playing more sort of like an e6 4 knights Sicilian, and actually Gino has me effective this week playing some Sicilian dragon just to get a little more tactics in my games.
Cool. Yeah, it can be a good idea to switch up the openings regularly just to see like different types of positions and structures. Because the idea is you learn in one opening will often be applicable elsewhere if the structure is similar. So it's good to get a lot of experience. Okay, so here our opponent hits us with c4, knight f6, bishop f5, bishop d3. We trade this one, looks good. e6, castles, bishop e7 here, white takes, and ed5. So yeah, I think this was actually a really important decision here. Take me through your thought process on cd5, ed5.
I guess I feel like knight taking was the better move, as it keeps me from having an isolated pawn. I thought the isolated pawn, when I took with the pawn, I thought that perhaps it would be more drawish. But immediately after I took with the pawn, I wished that I'd taken with the knight to keep from having an isolated pawn, because it turned out I, for one reason or another, that I can't specify, the white's isolated pawn seemed a lot stronger than mine. Or maybe it's just that white had a tempo on me. But yeah, I certainly was wishing that I'd kept my pawns as 4 and 2 rather than 3 + 1 + 2. So
yeah, definitely. To me, this is a really clear decision, right? We just want to take with the knight and leave white with the isolated pawn on d4. What you said is actually really close, because here it's like it is more of a drawer structure. And in a symmetrical structure, when the pawns are exactly the same, it really is all about the piece activity. So the fact that white is already castled and you're not, here it basically means like only white can be better. Maybe you can equalize if you defend accurately, but he does have at least 1 or 2 tempo on you, because yeah, he's castled and it's white's turn right now, and like his queen. So you can play like rook e1 or bishop g5. He's already connected his rooks, and you're a little bit behind.
Yeah, the other thing is I recognize that I opened the E file by taking with the pawn as well, which does not benefit me considering I'm not castled.
Yeah, it's again something, right, that white can use first, and then you'll have to kind of fight for it. So yeah, these two games actually we see like kind of an interesting dynamic of the d5 square. Really interesting, actually. So if I could go back to the first one real quick. So in this game, we were playing white, and the opponent played a Slav defense. Usually this one comes from the move order like d4, d5, c4, c6. Actually, it's a good time to talk about the whole point behind the Queen's Gambit. Which is to fight for the e4 square, right? We play c4, we dangle this pawn. If black takes it, then we get to play e4, either right away or like later on. And then when white wins back the pawn, we get this big, strong center on d4, e4. It's basically the Queen's Gambit in a nutshell. So when black plays c6 here, or e6, their idea is to just keep control over the d5 square and logically continuing from that to control the e4 square. So their point is always to be able to take back on d5 with the pawn. It's kind of like the whole point of the Slav. Take back on d5 with the pawn and control the e4 square. So that's why later on we already discussed this part. I think one of your key strategic mistakes in this game, maybe the only, like, honestly, yeah, probably the only, like, I would say serious mistake, was taking on d5, because we kind of allowed black to then equalize the structure, get their pawn to d5, control e4. I like that they took this way, kind of opens up the e file. They can maybe take cd as well, but okay, ed was, I think, actually the right way to go. But in your game, let's go to this one. And at this moment, when white took on d5, here it feels logical for you to take back with the pawn and keep control over the e4 square. But ironically, it's actually better to take with the knight, because it leaves white with this weak pawn on d4.
Yes.
So it just shows there are like no like hard and fast rules in chess. There's like always going to be exceptions, but it's just interesting to compare like the two situations. And here the thing is that I mean, I know you said the other one was more drawish, but this one is actually, like, I think black is better. And a lot of strong players really love positions like this, where they get to just pile up on the isolated queen pawn, because it's like a very simple approach. You put your bishop on f6, you castle, you bring a rook to d8, you bring the other one to c8, and then eventually you just take the pawn. Like, it's very difficult for white to fully defend it once all of your pieces are out. You might even break with e5 at some point and use the pressure on the d file. So yeah, this one was definitely definitely a really important moment. So much so that actually I would also say at this moment, instead of bishop e7, which gives white a chance to kind of save themselves from the structure with c5, I would say at this moment, the right move was definitely to just take on c4.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
So basically giving white, guaranteeing that we get the better structure, because white is left with this weak d pawn. We already traded the light scored bishops, which I would say is probably pretty huge for black, as usually this light scored bishop for white is causing havoc on this diagonal. If you can imagine bishop on this diagonal, black's bishop on c8, totally different story. Here we've traded off our bad bishop for white's good bishop. So yeah, I would say black is already super happy here, and as long as we can just castle and put our knight on d5, we'll be really happy here. That all makes sense?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, definitely like positional structural thing. So let's see what happens. So rook f8, and okay, a6, rook e2, b5. Okay, I didn't really understand a6, but now it seems like your idea was to push this one. Maybe I'm seeing a little bit of a pattern. This one reminds me of the previous game when you pushed like b4, b5.
Yes.
Before getting... sorry, my arrows are not working for me. In the previous game, you pushed b4, b5 before getting your rook in.
Okay.
And this is kind of a similar thing, like playing b5, but our rooks aren't yet connected in this position. So it's really important for us to connect rooks before white has a chance to go rook e1 and just totally pile up on the e file.
Yes, and I guess I mean, obviously, or it was obvious. I guess I didn't know how to respond to the obvious threat of the rooks being doubled. Oh, I think the other reason why I pushed b5 was so that I can move the rook to a7 to defend e7.
Oh, I see.
So I think I initially played a6 to keep the knight off of b5, and then when it became obvious that white was going to double rooks on the e file, I moved the pawn up so I could give move the rook to a7.
I gotcha. It makes sense. Yeah, I guess the issue is that it's basically a very like kind of passive setup. You're just defending and just holding that, or hoping that everything is gonna hold, which is a difficult strategy because it one thing could crack and then that's it. It's like game over. And you also give your opponent the opportunity to just kind of slowly build up. And yeah, usually things kind of fall apart. So yeah, the way to deal with this pressure is to basically you try to liquidate, you try to trade pieces. So the first idea I would look to kind of make work is to find a way to trade pieces on the e file, because this is kind of where the pressure is coming from, like rook to e1, and then there's pressure on the bishop. White is going to have threats like bishop takes f6, and then we can't take back because a rook on e8 might be hanging. So we really have to kind of get the bishop off of the e file and open up the rook, because it's not like a pin in the sense that the bishop can't move, but it's acting like a pinned piece because it's just a sitting target on e7, and that's tactically very vulnerable. So whenever we can, we try to let's say solve the problem rather than patching the problem. Patching the problem is like defending the piece, whereas solving the problem is like unpinning it. So a move that I would look at to try to make work, I don't think it does work, but the first move I would kind of consider is like something like bishop d6, just to see what happens if I just unpin. But you might have been considering this one during the game. The problem is white takes on e8. We have to take back and then can take on f6.
Yes, definitely.
And although we solved one problem, we created a bunch of new problems. around our king side. Not to mention the d5 pawn is hanging. So there's a lot of reasons this doesn't work at all, but okay, so that one is out. Can't do that one.
I also considered knight to e4, but I thought I would lose a pawn at the end of that exchange.
Right. Well, I think you're right on both counts. Like, it's definitely a very good move to consider because it kind of eases the pressure. You're initiating trades, but it does seem like it loses a pawn after bishop takes e7 and then taking here. Yeah, so I think you're right to avoid that one as well. So then, yeah, the next move is actually an idea that I know from e4, e5 positions. Let me put a different position on the board real quick. Do you ever play e4, e5 much?
No, I have not.
Oh, okay. Well, this will be useful in case you ever get these positions. Say here. So, in the Italian game, there is a really interesting dynamic. Like, black puts the bishop on c5, and then at a certain point is going to play d6, and then maybe a6, and castles, and h6. And then the move order of when black plays all these moves, it really can depend on a lot of things. But one thing that players like doing is they wait to play d6. Let's say black goes a6 here. Just kind of a useful move because it gives the bishop a chance to drop back if it needs to. And let's say white castles, black castles, and then white goes bishop g5. So this is often a really annoying pin for black to deal with. But since black hasn't pushed d6 yet, what a lot of players will do is they'll first kick the bishop with h6, ask the question, where are you going to go? Are you going to take on f6, give up your beautiful dark square bishop? That would be great. Probably not. White usually will go bishop h4. And then black's idea is to play bishop e7 here, neutralizing the pin with the intended follow-up knight h5, which is a nice idea because not only it trades off the bishops, but then the knight heads towards the f4 square.
Okay.
You probably heard the phrase like, knights on the edge are bad or, whatever. But if the knight is heading to f4, it's a good idea. As long as the knight doesn't stay on h5. And yeah, this actually often ends up working out for black. So going back to your game, if we can make this knight h5 move work in this position, that would be a nice way to kind of liquidate the pressure. And I like knight h5 here more than knight h7, for example, because this one seems to be more active, kind of, again, heading towards this f4 square. And this move looks like actually might even be an equalizer. Like, we're offering a lot of trades, and the more pieces you trade off, the easier your position kind of gets, because you trade off all of white's active pieces, you just leave yourself with equality. Now your knight can come back and rook can get into the game, and everything is fine. So this was kind of a subtle moment. I don't want to like harp on this one at all, really. But the interesting thing about this game is that like your position here is actually already critical, and important part of chess is understanding when you're under pressure and knowing that you're kind of like, it's kind of like a ticking time bomb. It's only a matter of time before your position collapses, so you got to ease the pressure as much as you can when you're behind, behind in development. I think that's a big part of chess, is like recognizing who's better and why. In this case, it's like white is better because of the development, so that kind of tells you like, okay, you got to trade pieces and try to simplify. Or on the other hand, if you have the advantage and you have big space advantage or you're way ahead, then when you're attacking, I shouldn't be trading. I should be looking for, the knockout blow or looking for ways to increase the pressure. Cool. So he played here. I think already could have taken on f6 using the fact that if queen takes, there's going to be knight takes d5. And I think this should just be good for white. Meaning we might have to take with the g pawn here on f6, which again would be not so great, but he goes bishop g3 instead. Knight e5 just slowly building up. We took on e5. Oh, wow, very interesting. He takes with the pawn. just to kick your knight away from d5. Blocking 3 pieces in the meantime, but it's kind of worth it anyway because he wins the d pawn. But this was well played by your opponent. I feel like he handled this position really well. Okay, rook e3, not sure what that's about. I think he can just push e6 and just break through already, but okay, takes his time. Queen c4. Oh, that's interesting. So you offer the endgame here. And maybe not actually a bad idea. Like here the engine says after bishop f6, apparently things are not that bad for black still. But that was an interesting moment. Can you take me through this one?
I could see that I felt like the queen lined up with my king on g8, and it's just so much pressure down the e file. I just felt like, White had so many threats that I was probably just looking to to just have a little break from these threats.
I see. Well, no, but that's really good because you're doing exactly what we just talked about. It's like you feel the pressure and you're trying to kind of like solve the problem.
Yes.
Which really important when we're defending is like, yeah, challenging the opponent's pieces, offering trades, or looking for advantageous trades. Not all exchanges are going to be good, but yeah, if you can trade off your opponent's active queen and get them into an endgame where you're only a pawn down, you can absolutely have drawing chances there. I know it didn't work out in this game, but apparently if you play this move bishop f6, like things are not that bad. White can trade a lot of pieces still. But then we end up with this bishop versus knight endgame where we're down a pawn, but we're only down 1 pawn. So it's still kind of, you have some drawish chances. Because of course, if all the pawns run out, then yeah, we have a draw. Really quick, what would be your strategy in some endgame like this as black?
Most likely to get my king into the game. One issue I have is that I've got 2 isolated pawns on the queen side. And if I can get those, whereas White has 2 connected pawns. But I guess I have my dark squared bishop is more mobile than the knight. Mm-hmm. So I am a little confused as to whether I need to be protecting my pawns, in other words, putting them on dark squares, or putting my pawns on light squares to give my bishop more room to maneuver. I'll say that it's, yeah. But of course, my king can't really defend both sides of the board. So I guess that's sort of what I'm thinking. But I have a feeling it's on a case by case basis, depending on what that knight is doing.
Yeah, no, you said a couple of very correct things. So number one, king activity is really important here. So whatever ends up happening, your king needs to play a role. And as much as you can when you're in endgames, especially when you have like a king and one other piece, like king and rook endgame, king and bishop, and so on. The king is like your second piece, and it's a very, very important attacker and defender. And you also said that the bishop is much stronger than the knight in this kind of position, which is absolutely true because the bishop can attack things on both sides of the board. For example, a bishop on d4 can attack both the king side and the queen side, and it's very mobile, whereas the knight is very immobile. It has to choose one side of the board. But the advantage that the knight has is that when the action is localized, if all the action is on one side of the board versus another, then the knight kind of has the advantage because the knight can jump and attack any color square at once. Of course, the bishop can only attack its own color.
Yes.
So Question in the chat, how would you evaluate trading the bishop for the knight here? Definitely a big no-no, because number one, we're down a pawn. So going for the king and pawn endgame down a pawn is going to be a really risky ploy. And I wouldn't do it unless I thought I was winning it. Yeah, just more generally, I think the bishop is definitely a much stronger piece than the knight here. So we want to keep it on the board. The one thing I would add that you didn't really mention, I know you weren't sure about what to do with the pawns here, is that as the defending side, the side with less material, we are usually going to be interested in trading pawns. That's kind of specifically what our plan is. Because the more pawns you trade off, the closer you get to a very drawish endgame. If you can imagine an endgame with a knight and pawn against the bishop, well, all you have to do to draw that is sacrifice your bishop for the last remaining pawn.
Okay.
Right? But if it's 2 versus 1, 2 pawns versus 1, and you give up your bishop for 1 pawn, you might still lose that as long as your opponent still has a pawn. So our idea here is to try to liquidate the pawn. So one plan would be to push like h5, g5, h4, and try to trade pawns this way. And where does the king go? Well, I would try to keep the king as active as possible. To me, it looks like the king could absolutely run to the queen side and try to put some pressure on white's pawns over there. All in all, I mean, I think we definitely still take white here because white is up a pawn, but compared to the position you had like a couple moves ago, this is like a dream because you're defending, but it's you're definitely within the drawing zone. Whereas without the queens, with the queens on the board, we were like on the verge of getting mated here, you know, after e6 and the position kind of opening up. So I want to say this was definitely a good decision to go for the endgame. Of course, we could have followed it up better, but yeah, that's how it goes. Okay, and I think this one ended with like rook blunder. But this position was already very difficult because we're under pressure and maybe losing a second pawn here. So it looks like pretty difficult endgame.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate when I traded queens. I didn't anticipate how difficult it would be to hold on to the 2 pawns. Yeah. So I remember blundering. But yeah, I guess my primary concern was not protecting my rooks, but how I was gonna. It seemed like unless I could defend those, figure out a way to defend those pawns, I was gonna be lost. So
yeah, the issue was the pawns, but it was also the pin on the e file, because here after rook e6, it's like the bishop can't move and your rook on e8 can't move. And yes. Because your pieces are kind of stuck, this is what makes it really difficult. Even if white just chills, it's like really hard. You got to go back to d8 and then try to unpin. And then by the time you're doing that, then white can of course start taking more pawns. So that's why it was really critical, actually, again at this moment, to play bishop f6 at a time when you can get out of the pin. So again, like liquidating the pressure. Very instructive move, actually, this bishop f6, just like totally. Just letting white's attack kind of whiff by. Cool, let me open up another game here. Okay, so we were playing white here. Okay, facing the Grunfeld, bishop f4. Oh boy, looks like black got a really quick initiative here. Yeah, okay, let's go back. Oh, b5, nice move. Nice trick. Oh, somewhere we also lost the piece. Oh, right
yes.
here. Right. Yeah. Okay, so this one we got in trouble from the opening, it feels like. So let's try to break down what happened. So we had a really sharp game. Black goes c5, just like blasting open the center, introducing all this like pawn tension. Queen b3, knight c6, takes. And then I'm guessing you didn't take on c4 here because of knight a5.
I didn't take on c4 because of the bishop on e6.
Oh.
Oh.
Well, here you can take, like if black takes, then you'll just take back.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, it was, let's see here. Yeah, knight a4, I was worried about knight a4, yeah.
Yeah, this one, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, but we end up going back queen d1, and then it feels like we lost a lot of time because we play queen b3 and then back to d1, right?
Yeah.
So it's yeah, really problematic when this happens in the opening, because it's like, well, better it would have been better to not even move the queen out at all. It seems critical would have been at this point to actually grab the b pawn.
Yeah, and I spent a long time calculating whether I could do that, and what I did not factor in was that I had a bishop. The bishop on f4 is in possession of the b8 square. So I was blind to the fact that my bishop controlled b8. If I take that bishop off the board, the bishop on f4, I think I felt like it would be, so that's what I felt like it would be very dangerous for me to take that pawn. But once again, I forgot that I had the bishop guarding b7. So, yeah.
Gotcha. No, it's actually really interesting. Yeah, this bishop makes things a lot easier for white to stomach, because it is a very risky pawn to grab, these b pawns, and we don't want to just take them lightly, because we spend a lot of time with our queen to go and grab this pawn, and and we give our opponent time to develop. But at the same time, it's really important to recognize that queen takes b7 is not just a pawn grab. You're also undermining all of black's position, because now the knight on c6 is hanging too.
Yes.
And the knight on c6 really liked not hanging the move before.
Yeah. I just, like I said, I didn't factor in that I was in control of b8. So I saw queen takes b7 and the knight to a5.
Right.
And I visualized that, but I didn't visualize that I couldn't do enough calculating, even forgetting that I had the bishop on f4. I didn't feel confident. I definitely wanted to take that pawn, but after thinking about it, I backed away. So,
but here's the thing, Danny, I don't blame you for not taking the pawn. I mean, at this point, it looks like it was the best move, and it does feel like the critical move, because everything else is like you're just going backwards. But I think what got you into this trouble was really just this move, queen b3. Because similar to the first game you looked at, remember when you played like knight h4 and then h3, and then you didn't go for it fully with g4, you ended up going back, knight f3. It's kind of like a similar thing. It's like when you start going down this very ambitious path, if you don't commit to it, then you just end up losing time.
yes.
So the issue is not that like, oh, you didn't take on b7, because that does look really, really scary. And then, if you lose 5 moves after that, your coach is going to be like, what are you doing? Why are you grabbing this pawn, right? Like, so it makes chess so hard. There are no 100% rules. It's always like case-by-case basis. But for me, I'm feeling that like when we play on the queen side a lot in the opening, what we're doing is we're neglecting the king side development, right? Because now your bishop on f1 still needs to move, and then you'll need a tempo to castle. And this is actually can be a very risky and very ambitious way of playing, because you're neglecting your king side development for like queen side gain. And the idea is that, well, if you win on the queen side, then okay, you'll castle later, and then you'll have a good position. So like something I'm sure the engine will show is exactly what white can do here. So let's say like we took on b7, black played knight a5 or something. We bring the queen back, and I don't know, black makes some move here. Let's say rook to c8. And what the engine sees is that white is going to be able to develop in time. And let's just make some random moves for black. And if white is able to develop, well, now we've kind of kept our extra pawn. It's a weird structure, but we have an extra pawn. And our king is safe, so there's no compensation. So I guess the point is, there's a lot of upside, but it requires a lot of risk. And this isn't always the most practical way to play in the opening. If it were up to me, I would prefer you play lines where you castle early and often, and then you can play on the queen side, or you can choose your plan depending on the position. But playing openings where our king gets stuck on e1, it's almost like it's always just a risky strategy that you really have to be experienced to handle. So it's not like, in my opinion, the best types of positions to play when you're kind of like working on improving your chess and like learning a lot of different opening ideas. That's one of the reasons I and a lot of coaches typically suggest players to play e4 up until they reach some higher level, because e4 is kind of a more direct approach. It's like you get your knight out, you get your bishop out, you castle, and then you figure out what to do. And you're less less often kind of getting hung up in the opening, like chasing queenside play and then kind of neglecting your kingside development. So something to think about. I mean, I'm not saying don't play d4, but it definitely, we, as much as we can, don't want to go on these like excursions in the opening. We want to kind of stick to like a more like solid approach. So if we were just being ultra solid here, what we would do is we would just trade on like d5, for example, kind of liquidate some of the tension. Let's say knight takes d5, bishop takes d5. Okay, apparently we can even take on c5 here, and maybe this is the way to go, but I would just keep things simple and just try to like develop my pieces and castle, and then just play from there. I think Engine maybe hates this move. But the point is, it is hard to follow up on ambitious play. And that's often how we get into trouble, because queen b3 is a very ambitious move, and your opponent, to his credit, comes up with a really strong response. Knight c6 just says, go ahead, take whatever pawns you want. I'm just playing for piece activity. And yeah, now it's like a really difficult position for white to play, because we're behind in development. We have all these pawn captures in the center that are possible, and it's really easy for things to go badly wrong. Okay, let's jump to another game.
Okay.
I think we have like 3 more games I want to just briefly run through. Okay, next game, I think you are black in this one. And we got the e5 Caro. Cool. So here, yeah, your position looks fantastic. And like, you didn't have to do anything special. All you did was develop your pieces. You did use this kind of nice plan of c5 and bringing this other knight to c6. I'm guessing this is something you learned previously?
I think I was improvising at this point. Yeah, I think, yeah, I was definitely improvising. I think what must have, yeah, I think, yeah, I was improvising.
Okay.
I think looking at this position now, I'd probably choose just this more direct knight to c6 from the queen side. Um,
Yeah, actually, both are possible. This knight e7 is a very real move. Black's issue in this line is that, yeah, sometimes you have pieces fighting for kind of the same squares.
right.
Um, and yeah, especially the knight on g8 is the one that we really have to kind of solve. But there are a couple of approaches. So one is to, yeah, like bring the queenside knight to c6 and then bring this other guy out either to g6 or even more commonly back the bishop up to g6 and then bring this guy out to f5, where you can put pressure on the d4 square. But I kind of like what you did as well, actually. I think it ended up working out because you put this knight on c6, your other knight goes to d7, and then this knight on d7 can one day either go to b6 and help you on the queen side, or it can even jump to f8 if you need it on the king side or support with like an f6 break, which seems like you ended up playing in a couple moves. Yeah. And now basically you got like a dream Caro-Kann, which is basically actually a dream French. Is you have a French defense structure, but with the bishop on f5, which is a really good piece. Okay, so f6, knight c5. We took this one. Queen c7. Huh. So you took the pawn and then white didn't take back for some reason. Weird. Seems like he should have just taken back, right? I guess your opponent was afraid of something here.
Yeah, if you take, yeah, I. I guess he maybe didn't want to give up control over c5. But obviously he loses control of c5 if I. Oh, and well, there's a pin, so my yeah, maybe he's hoping that I take on c5 and then I lose my queen. Or excuse me, take on d4 and lose my queen. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, odd. I don't know, because he goes back, and then you support e5 now with bishop f6. A6. Oh, again we see this a6 move. What's the idea of it here? To stop bishop b5?
Yes.
Okay.
And maybe because I can't see other options.
I guess you're kind of pinned, so it's hard to move. I don't know. Actually, we'll come back to this. Let me go back here. I think probably it would have been good to take immediately. Now, a lot of times in chess, people say like it's good to increase the pressure, like queen c7. But in this case, you allow white to kind of, well, basically keep control over the e5 square. Because after takes, your opponent should have just recaptured, and then he gets to keep a piece on e5, which is a really, really nice outpost.
Yeah.
Had we taken on e5 first, if knight takes e5, we force white to take with the pawn. And, okay, the c5 pawn here is hanging, so we might be able to just win this one right away. But even if not, we have moves like queen a5, and then we'll probably pick up the pawn in the future. But the reason that this is happening is because we got white's d pawn to head to e5, and now instead of this d4 pawn controlling e5 and c5, white now controls neither of these squares.
Yeah.
And so your structure here looks fantastic. I think black is much better here. So So this is kind of a structural thing, is like timing the trade, because you played f6, which is of course a really thematic idea in this position, because white has a lot of space and we want to challenge that. We need to create some room for our pieces. And then timing when to take on e5 is never like, let's say, an exact thing, but it's more about like we're looking for the structure that we want. And so if we can force our opponent to take with the pawn either right away or after the exchange of knights, then yeah, that definitely is an improvement for black, because now these pawns are more overextended.
Yes. I guess I probably was just thinking in terms of it's time for me to develop my queen.
Yeah. No, I think your move is totally logical. And I mean, if anything, I'm nitpicking just because most of your moves, I would say, follow like a really clear, like consistent path. Like you're just, like every move you make, you're either like developing something or improving something, with the exception though of some of these pawn moves. It seems like there are moments when you're not sure what to do. And I'm not saying that moves like a6 are necessarily bad. A lot of times it's better just to do nothing than to blunder, of course, and and lose. But I would say a lot of players are usually looking for ways of improving their pieces before pawns. So if you have any pieces that can still be improved, and I mean, in this case, I would definitely be trying to figure out how we're going to, again, like ease some of the pressure on this diagonal. Then this a6 move just doesn't feel very, that's the word I'm looking for here. It doesn't feel like the most urgent thing in the world. Yes. When we have all this other tension. Now the engine is saying like you could just unpin here, which is actually a really interesting suggestion. It says just queen a5, just whatever. Let white take the pawn. But the point is that we get to trade off all these pieces and again leave white with a super weak structure where both pawns are weak. And this is actually one of those paradoxical positions where it's like, according to the structure, it's like black has the bad bishop, because our bishop is on, or both bishops are on the light squares and our pawns are on the light squares. But bad bishops defend good pawns. Yeah. Which is a funny way to think, because now like white's bishop can't defend the pawns on e5 and c5. So this is kind of the other side of the coin. It's that like now white's pawns are overextended, and because of that, black is going to pick up one pawn, pick up the second pawn, and has a very nice long-term strategic advantage. So that's a really interesting suggestion by the engine. Just give the extra pawn back, but not really giving it back. The engine just calculates that like, well, one day we're going to win the pawn anyway.
Yeah.
If not this move, because I know a lot of players aren't just going to want to like give back their pawn. I think there are other ways of improving the position. For example, a move like bishop e4 makes sense to me, just putting a little bit more pressure on the knight, maybe even opening up the f file, and yeah, not making it easy for white either, because now at some point we might be threatening to just take on f3 and then there wouldn't be as much pressure on the e5 square.
Yes.
So let's see what happens. So, oh, play this move. Nice. Oh, finally your opponent takes. So yeah, as soon as you kind of increase the tension, your opponent starts simplifying, and this is nice for us, because we get the structure. We get white to put the pawn on e5. Now, it's an interesting decision. What made you decide to give up the bishop here versus the knight?
I guess I thought that the I guess the taking with the bishop was the more forcing move, and that it forced, although, let's see, sorry, I have to count the pieces.
Yeah, we basically have a choice here, right? To take either with bishop or with knight.
Yeah. It seemed more forcing in terms of, well, I guess I guess the question is what piece do I want to end up with in all this?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. I think I just felt that it was because I can't say that there's no. Maybe I was thinking about. I think my logic is that after the exchanges, I have an outpost on c4 for the knight.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, yeah, actually, that makes a lot of sense because your next move was knight a5.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I was just wondering about that. I would say, I mean, I think your dark sword bishop is probably the more important piece here. Okay. As good as the knight on c4 is, a strong bishop is still going to be stronger than that knight. Yeah. So yeah, I think probably this one was the right way to go. And then... we can think about taking on e5, but it looks kind of scary because then we end up in a pin at the end. And then there's this move f3, so I wouldn't want to go into this unless I know how I'm going to get out of this one. But it's really not about winning the pawn immediately. It's actually more about just leaving white with this weak pawn. And you can drop back bishop e7, take on c5 at some point. And yeah, again, your structure here is going to be kind of like long-term better. So let's see what happened here. So take on c5, queen b4.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm remembering this game.
Yeah, unfortunate. And then you can't even take the rook because of the checkmate. So let's see what happened here. Looks like we got into some tactical trouble. White played queen a4. We took the pawn. We got pinned. Rook fc8, f3, and then do you remember what was going on at this moment? What was your calculation like here?
Honestly, I don't. I remember wanting to protect the knight. Yeah, I think I got so obsessed with protecting the knight, I probably did not even see. I did not see the pin, and obviously, let's see. I did not realize my queen was pinned. I had a moment of blindness.
Oh, I gotcha.
Because I'm basically it's definitely a moment of blindness where I just did not see the I think what I saw was the queen. When the queen moved to b4, I saw a double attack on the rook and the knight, but I did not see my queen on e7.
Gotcha.
So I went blind because I saw a double attack on a5 and c5 as opposed to the
So then rook fc8, f3, and you're like, oh, you forgot to defend your rook, buddy.
Yes, exactly.
That's funny. Cool. Okay. Obviously, that will happen, and I don't have a lot of tips for you here, other than it just takes a lot of practice. And of course, during the game, one of the most important factors is focus. And I mean, for players of all level, I think even for me, it's like sometimes I'm playing and I'm like checking my phone, or I'm like on another tab on the side. And it's like, and then I lose the game and I'm like, oh man, I'm so bad. But it's like, well, I wasn't exactly putting myself in the best position up front. Not that I'm saying that's what you were doing, just that your focus during the game is really important. And so a lot of times, or basically it's a matter of learning to be focused for the full game, which gets harder as you play over the board. And these games can last like 4 to 6 hours, and you can easily ruin a good position after 4, 5, 6 hours of play deep in the end game. So it's really really just actually, I would say, important and kind of underrated skill is just being able to stay focused for long periods of time.
I would say that there's also when pieces are attacked on a section of the board, I guess it can be hard for me at my level to see the entire board. And so, I mean, I guess, just that sort of takes time, but especially when there are threats on one side of the board, it's easy to maybe psychologically fixate on those threats, like the threat the threat against my rook and knight, as opposed to the piece. I would say that I've lost a fair amount of games due to some much longer diagonal, for example. So in this case, the diagonal is just three away, but I would say that it was probably because I became fixated on my undefended knight over there on a5, most likely.
Yeah, no, well, chess blindness is very real, and the full board visualization that you were talking about is definitely a really common thing. Obviously, I mean, yeah, when it comes to visualization, it's hard to keep the full board into account. And yeah, there are just so many moments, I look back, like I blundered something, and then I think about like what I was thinking at that moment, and I'm like, yeah, I wasn't even aware of this diagonal, or I wasn't even aware that this piece was touching this square. So it's very, very common. And yeah, again, I don't have any like eureka tips. It's it's just a matter of practice and like just taking your time when you're calculating and trying to focus on each move of the calculation, and especially whenever the opponent makes a move during your games, it's very helpful to kind of internalize exactly all the potential squares the queen is kind of hitting, and just kind of taking stock. Okay, let me jump to, there was one or two more games. I just want to quickly
You're right. I was definitely thinking, oh, look at that rook all the way on the other side of the board. I don't need that knight when I can take that rook.
That's funny. Okay, so here we got London system. Nice, got your bishop out. So here your opponent is the one who I would say takes on d5 kind of early and lets you equalize the structure. Bishop b4, a5. Yeah, you played this opening really well. Oh, that looks like a mouse slip.
That was definitely a mouse slip, yes.
Yeah, that's a shame. Yeah, if you just castled here, your position's great. All your pieces have good squares, and you have this really nice e4 square you can use. This is actually known as the Carlsbad structure, where specifically white has traded the c-pawn for your e-pawn. And let's just say this is a good version because you control the e4 square, and your one knight can jump to e4, the other knight can drop and support with knight f6. You have rook f8, and yeah, really solid position, no weaknesses. So I like how you play the opening here. And then yeah, once this happens, it's really tough. It can be really tough to come back.
It's kind of tough psychologically after something like this happens.
Yeah, you feel like you ruined your position for like no reason. So yeah, no worries. Okay, well, I think we got to wrap up the show soon, but I feel like we have I have my thoughts in order. What I would say going through your games is that you definitely want to be, let's say, thinking about structure as you're playing, specifically when it relates to exchanges. So whenever you trade a piece or offer a trade, you want to think about exactly whether the structure is going to change and whether that's in your favor or not. Okay. So we saw a couple of examples before, like not going for the isolated queen pawn, which I think would have been good, or I mean not leaving your opponent with that one. and then trading on d5 and letting the opponent kind of recapture and equalize the center, and then like in the Caro, not taking on e5 immediately to like leave them with that weak pawn on e5.
Okay.
So this is something that is really important to think about as you're playing the middle game, because I think your opening play is generally solid, and then when we get to the middle game, yeah, it seems like maybe you're not sure exactly when you want to trade and in which situations. And then the second thing I notice in middle games in particular is that we want to focus on improving your pieces as much as you can. I think there are a couple moments you like started making pawn moves, and yeah, those are not often the most helpful depending on the situation, especially if you have pieces that can get into the game, or if you have some kind of problem like one of your pieces is pinned and you need to kind of like liquidate that pressure. It's really important to be like proactive about that. And then when it comes to the openings, I would say for the most part, I feel like your openings are really solid, and I like what you're doing. Just the one thing that we talked about when you're playing white is you want to try not to be too ambitious when we're playing d4. So like that means like bringing the queen out too early. And if you are going to be ambitious, then you got to commit. So if you're going to play queen b3 and your opponent doesn't defend their b pawn, then you got to take it. That's kind of like the logical follow-up. And if it works, good. If it doesn't work, well then, yeah, it means the whole idea to play queen b3, in the first place is that it has to be kind of rethought. Personally, I'm a fan of playing more straightforward openings where, yeah, we're just kind of developing, castling, and then figuring out a middle game plan. But yeah, if you do find yourself in a spot where you're kind of like overextending, then yeah, either you have to commit or don't put yourself in that position in the first place.
I have a question actually, because I know that that in that particular game it was the Grunfeld, and it seems like black can make things sharp. Like for example, when I've played in that, the reason I chose that opening is because I've ended up with all my all the queen side pawns gone, and just
yeah.
Do you feel like the approach that I took was still a sort of a good approach generally, minus the or do you feel like there's a better way of playing against the Grunfeld that is or maybe need the castle soon? I don't know.
No, I'm really glad you asked. Actually, that's a good question. So let me pull up the game here. Yeah, so you chose this variation. Okay, we get the Grunfeld by transposition with bishop f4 and rook c1. And I actually think this line, although it's been played by a lot of super GMs, so it's a very real variation. So this is where we start kind of neglecting the kingside development, because we get the queenside rook in, but our king is still on e1. We haven't even like opened up our light squared bishop, and black is already castled. So it's like, so this is already like we're already behind in development at this point. So what I would say is instead of bishop f4. I would take on d5.
Yes.
Knight takes d5, e4, like capturing the center. They'll take on c3, b takes c3. They'll probably play c5 because this is what the Grunfeld is all about, like putting pressure on d4. And then you can play like, let's say, bishop e2. For example, black castles. And you can castle.
Okay.
And then from here, this bishop can often go to like either e3 or g5. Queen can go like maybe queen d2 or queen c2 to defend the e-pawn. And then rooks go to the center, usually edc files, kind of depending on what the opponent does. Like if black quickly takes on d4, then maybe, you want your rooks on the C and D files, for example. If they don't take on D4, if they don't open the C file, maybe you want to bring, this rook over to D1 and put the other rook on E1. It will always kind of depend. But this is like a very simple approach where you just kind of get your king castled, and then you decide where to put the dark squared bishop, where to put the queen, where to put the rooks.
Okay.
And that's what we would refer to as like completing your development. Like first you castle, and then completing the development basically means connecting rooks. So that was one thing you didn't really do in all your games, is like connect your rooks, because for a few reasons, but it's basically tactically and strategically sound. Yeah. Well, okay. Hopefully that all made sense and was useful.
Yeah, that's great. No, it was wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, obviously, I think I make this point every episode of the show. Like, obviously, tactics are going to be super important, but there's not a whole lot I can help you there other than, like telling you to do a lot of tactics.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know you've been working hard because you did the Chess King app that I recommended to you guys way back when, and
Yes.
so yeah, I mean, tactics are always going to be a part of the game, something important to work on. But the tips that I gave, hopefully you can work on concurrently, either with your coach or when you're playing your games. You can kind of think about these things. But for the most part, I think you're on a really good path because you're doing a lot of like the really critical stuff already. Playing long time control games, analyzing them, trying to learn from your mistakes, solving puzzles, like doing tactics regularly. That's like 95% of the of the work is those like kind of critical things. But cool, Danny. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Danny, for participating. It was a lot of fun. And well, the idea of the show is to check in with you in a couple of months and see how you're doing.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to. Thank you.
Awesome. So we'll look forward to catching up with you.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. I'll catch you guys later.